Today's guest is Mr. Chai Chuah. Mr. Chai was appointed Director General of Health in March 2015 after acting in the role for 16 months. Originally from Malaysia, Chai studied commerce at Canterbury University before commencing a career with PricewaterhouseCoopers in New Zealand and internationally. He has been a prominent figure in the New Zealand health sector for 25 years, first with Canterbury DHB, where he was a Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operating Manager, and Acting Chief Executive, before spending over 7 years as Chief Executive of Hutt Valley DHB. He has been in national leadership roles with the Ministry of Health since 2010, when he became National Director of the National Health Board. He has a passion for building a health system together with other partners, which is powered by the needs of people it serves, and which is prepared for rapid changes in technology and demographics. He is focused on driving change in the way the health system works with other public services, communities, and other non public services partners to improve health outcomes, increase access to quality care, improve financial and clinical sustainability, and to develop a unified health system. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Troubleshooters podcast. First of all, a big thank you to Mr. Chai here for agreeing to be my first podcast guest. He's joining us today from New Zealand, where it's really early in the morning right now. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Anjali. Real pleasure to be part of this.
Thank you. So, Chai, today we're discussing the topic of proactive versus reactive healthcare. Now, when
Yeah,
we look around us and see the decisions being made, one can't help but notice that most of our healthcare decisions have been reactive. So, first question is this true, like what we see around us about reactive health? And if it is, then why is that the norm? Why does this happen?
that is an extremely, first of all, an astute observation. And the answer to that is not a simple one. So there are a number of contributing factors. So
Mhm.
perhaps if I just throw in a few.
Yeah, sure.
Uh,
Thank you.
I think the most obvious one, which most people will kind of put your finger on, is that the it's reactive because of the way health policies are made. So in my time in the public service, where you and in this instance, I'm talking about policy making in the public service for health.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so normally policies are actually developed by public servants or in the public service. And in most instances, it will be the Department of Health or the Ministry of Health policy section that does that. Now, if you and the policy section is normally staffed by highly intelligent, highly qualified personnel who are passionate about setting policy. Now, however, some of them actually have joined the service in the policy section because they see a gap in the policy and they want to be part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, when they get into those roles, they start suggesting this policy and that policy, etc., etc. Most of these policies that these people are championing actually goes nowhere, uh, even if they've gone through a very protracted process. Now, the reason for that, and this is coming back to my point around why policies are reactive, is that policies that eventually that gets translated into some sort of a program or part of the health system needs to have political backing.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is that politicians, when they stand for election, normally try to get a sense around what are the frustrations of the public. And in trying to get elected, they will make all sorts of promises. And most of these promises are just statements
Mm-hmm.
and sound bites. And they have very little idea around how to actually implement them or indeed what sort of policies, funding, resources required, et cetera, et cetera. So when they get elected, normally one of the first conversation takes place between an incoming minister
Mm-hmm.
and the senior public servants, particularly in health, in this case, will be, so, Minister, I noticed that in getting elected, you have made all these promises. How can I help to translate that into reality? So that's kind of like the statement that most good public servants will say.
Yeah.
And of course, the minister has no idea, and what follows will be uh, a very long and protracted process. And so by the time, and if those promises get translated into policies, it takes anything from uh, 6 months if it's super fast and it's really simple, um, to anything from even the entire parliamentary session, which
Mm-hmm.
means that it could take 3 or 4 years before anything
Yeah.
comes up. So, and when you look at the context of some of the issues that is facing health, whether it's 6 months or whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 years, it looks slow, it
Yeah.
looks reactive, and it is. And that's kind of like one of the reasons why sort of health policies looks reactive and is reactive. It's actually partly the process. Now, putting that aside, I think that that's a red herring. It's easy to blame, but I think the more fundamental issue is the reason why health policies is reactive is um, the people who are responsible for setting policies, whether it's politicians who come with an aspiration or promise, or indeed the public servants, have very little imagination or creativity
Mm-hmm.
to be able to be proactive. Uh, and part of that is history. It's because that if you look at healthcare, we've come from hundreds of years of being reactive, to be honest. I mean, we
Yes.
are largely very good at rescuing and treating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and public health is perhaps the part of the health system that's kind of proactive. But even public health, I think that in the hundreds of years since its come into formation, it's also been caught up uh, in this whole cycle of being trapped by bureaucracy, being trapped by arrogance and ignorance, and largely being out of touch with the fast pace of change in the surrounding environment. I think that is the real reason why we're seeing health policies is reactive. So first of all, that's a process. To
Mm.
me, that can be fixed.
Yeah.
But largely, I think it's more about the kind of people um, we have making decisions and who are in leadership position.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 certainly, I was in a very similar position and dangerously so
Yes.
until you know I regret that it took such a long time for me to be awakened
Mm-hmm.
by being told that I actually am reactive. And the reason for that is because I lack imagination and creativity. So I was already a director general when the person told me. I was absolutely shocked.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, is the nub of the issue. If we look around, the people that we rely on to lead us in healthcare, the lack of imagination and creativity is palpable.
Yeah.
Just listen to what they say. It is always the same things.
I agree with you on that, Chan. In fact, that's one of the things I was wondering about as well. Because now, yeah, I think if you look at governments across the world, yes, policies, the bureaucracy, and the political scenario comes into play. But we have, for example, the UN who put in the sustainable development goals, and we know health is one of them. There are sub goals under them. So we know that there are things to achieve, but there seems to be a gap somewhere over there between knowing what we need to do but on the ground policies being very different.
Yeah, so you mentioned the UN. So one of the privileges of being the Director General is that you get involved in UN processes.
Hmm.
And during my time, I think New Zealand was actually on the executive board of the WHO.
Yes.
Um, and going there for a couple of years, I think the UN is not immune to the bureaucratic
Hmm.
and the reactive um, um, time frame.
Yes.
Um, and and this might be unfair, but it looks increasingly like they are out of touch.
Hmm.
The people in New York, the people in Geneva, the people in the regional offices are out of touch with actually what is going on in the environment. When I say out of touch, it's not that they are not in touch, they are in
Hmm.
touch, but they're in touch with elements that they are familiar with.
Yes.
And and the uh, and the feeling of being reactive is because it is the other uh, elements or other sectors that these people have no network or little knowledge about that's actually putting the pressure on the health system and the well-being agenda for the global population.
Hmm.
And when you listen to the dialogue and um, there is a there is an intellectual understanding of the issue, and there's
Yes.
no doubt about that. But the issue is that, uh, and it's what I see in the New Zealand government as well, is the people who are responsible trying to make change at the political or even at the public service level actually have very little knowledge of how to implement change. Very little.
Yeah.
And and I found that quite frustrating because I've come from a career of implementation and doing
Yes.
things. And walking into that environment, it was kind of like you landing on Mars, you know? Um, so there's endless meeting, endless report writing, uh, and then there's a whole language that's designed for conversation, but very little action.
Mm. So there's a gap between what's on paper or what's part of plans versus what's actually happening on the ground. So there's like a an issue. It's not matching up, and uh, the skills are not there to match it up. Is that where we're going slightly?
Yeah, it is, and this is where it becomes more interesting and more difficult to unpack.
Mm.
Because just give an example, I was given a paper to read a week ago,
Hmm.
written by I think it was some thought leaders in the U.S. And they were very good papers. And the topic they touched on was values-based healthcare,
Yes.
outcomes-based healthcare, and integrated healthcare. Now, if you look at those titles, even the titles are good,
Yeah.
right? There's no question about that. And when you read through it, so how I say agree. And when I got to the end, I'm thinking, do I think it's going to get a chance, any chance of being implemented? The answer is no.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because, um, unfortunately for us, the environment and the challenges have become so complex
Hmm.
that we can't actually uh, implement solution using the tools and some of the knowledge and the skills and the processes we've developed
Yeah.
in the 20th century.
Hmm.
Uh, and 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 largely our institution, our processes, and our knowledge and skills in the health sector is still locked in the 20th century. Now,
Yes.
it's got a veneer of the 21st century lexicon on it in terms of technology, AI, big data, blah, blah, blah. But when you peel those away, they're still sitting like it's putting an engine block
Mm.
on the horse cart.
True. In fact, one thing that struck me when when I was thinking about this topic of proactive and reactive is this past year has obviously been extremely difficult for all of us. But the one thing that's happened, even though it was reactive, but policies and decisions were made so quick. Things were put on the ground, rules changed, policies changed. Now, I was writing a paper for India, and I have a startup in telehealth, but telehealth guidelines were a complete. It wasn't even they. There were no proper guidelines until COVID
Yeah.
started, and then COVID came in, and telehealth guidelines came up, and all of this. It just happened so quick. Now, do we need a pandemic to actually start putting things in place? There have been researchers and clinicians and people talking about telehealth forever, but it needed a pandemic across the world to actually kickstart policies in place. Now, this is, of course, the example of telehealth, but I'm sure there are lots of policies which have been, trying, it's stuck forever. And now we've shown that, yes, if there is intention,
Mm.
policies can come on the ground very quickly. So, why not when we are not in a pandemic? Why not with other, policies?
Okay. You touch on a very relevant point. If we step back from the scenario you just talked about,
Mhm.
it's a rescue situation.
Yes.
It's another rescue situation. So, in desperation, we realize what
Mm.
we're scrounging around looking for tools, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the funny thing is that the rescue situation, I mean, the situation we found, so it's actually we created them. We created the lockdown. So,
Yes.
the face-to-face stuff, which is actually the main institution prefer we're working,
Yeah.
that's why the frustration with the lack of speed of adoption on telehealth, etc.
Mhm.
Mainline institutions were putting out roadblocks, right?
Yep.
Because it threatened their vested interests and status
Exactly.
quo. Until unwittingly, as a result of the existential threat of COVID-19,
Yeah.
the powers that be made decisions without realizing that they were actually cutting off their leg.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So it's a rescue situation. It's a desperate situation. Having now cut off their leg, they're thinking, okay, what do we put back into that?
Yep.
And in scrounging around, and I think what decision makers realized that they run the risk of actually um, losing control.
Yes.
So as a concession, they were prepared to actually entertain and invite into, but still on their terms.
Yeah. Everything's on their terms. Yes.
Oh, yeah, still on their terms. And the interesting thing to watch now is there's no question, by the way, Angelique. I think that COVID-19 pandemic has opened the way to what a term I use quite a lot is a lot of the stalled technology advances. Those things have been stalled for many, many years,
Yeah.
right? It's stalled not because it's not effective, etc., etc. In fact, contrary, it's stalled because the powers that be, the mainstream organization, have much to lose to adopt those new innovations.
Yeah.
Now, COVID-19 comes along, they run the risk of losing even more.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a minor trade-off, they have agreed to concede to allow in
Yeah.
those stall technology because actually some of those people do know that this stall technology actually do work,
Yeah. In fact,
right?
a example of the a very stark example, because in our startup we've been living it, is we've been there for about 4 years, and we've been talking to many hospitals in India to integrate our telehealth system, teleconsult system into their maternity services, because we are primarily a maternity organization. And hospitals were so against it and so resistant, saying no, women would not want to do this, and they gave us a whole list of reasons. But now that COVID struck, each of those hospitals that I'm talking about, they all have their own mobile apps, they all have their own. So they went and then invested money
Yeah,
overnight
yeah,
to get that technology in place, and now they're all doing it.
yeah. So there are two things that they were threatened by.
Mm.
One was actually physical safety,
Yes.
right? So getting infected.
Yeah.
The second thing that they were threatened by was actually losing their business.
Yes, it's private health, especially in
Yeah.
this case. Yeah.
Well, even in public, if you look at any consultant who's got a department, blah 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 sort of stuff, they realize that after a while, look at public hospitals. Pretty much everything has come to a stop except for COVID,
Yes.
right? Now, in trying to restart those services again, right? Well, the first thing they think of, oh God, let's not allow anybody who's possibly infected to come near us, right? Um, so they got this dilemma around safety, but also they realized that if they don't start providing services after a while, and they run the risk of these patients either dying
Yes.
or actually going somewhere else.
Yes.
So that's why I think that you're seeing, the resurgence of some of these store technologies like telehealth is a very obvious example. You know, and I think another one that's actually flying in almost the same speed is the whole genomics medicine.
Yes.
All right. And there will be others around the fringe, like, I mean, the more innovative ones are talking about looking at, if you look at this whole paperless agenda for healthcare, I mean, for health and safety infection control, we
Yes.
are rapidly moving towards a paperless sort of system,
Yeah.
you know. Yeah. So again, the it's a rescue situation if you stand back.
So, what do we do? So, I think you've addressed it really well on why is it
Hmm.
reactive, and why are we stuck like this? Is there a way out, or is it just gonna continue like this?
So I think that so let's talk about uh, what do we do uh, to, if you like, introduce
Mm-hmm.
and be proactive uh, in introducing new models of care, innovative way of delivering, etc., right?
Yes.
Without necessarily waiting to sort of
Yes.
lock down the whole world and put millions of people out of jobs,
Yes.
right? Um, so I have been thinking about this for a very very long time, and actually, and it's and I borrow a lot of the thoughts from lots of other people who have written about this, right? And I thought about how would I actually use it in my career. And so what I'm about to say actually is um, many of it is not original thoughts, and some of these thoughts I've actually sort of added on my own interpretation and throw a few things in. So if we want to disrupt status quo,
Mm-hmm.
all right, and be more proactive in transforming the current fossilized glacial speed
Mm-hmm.
change in healthcare, uh, I think we need to look at the principle of disruption,
Yes.
right? And 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 I'm just going to throw in a couple of those thoughts, and I'm happy to actually drop you a note later on to try and organize these thoughts a lot better. So, if you observe where uh, innovation is able to enter mainstream
Mm-hmm.
in the context of no pandemic,
Yes.
it is normally around the fringe,
Yeah.
around the edges. Now, the reason why it's around the edges is because the mainstream power brokers and influencers don't pay attention on the edges.
Mm.
All right. All the energy is focused on their core.
Yes.
This is where their power base is. This is where the money is. This is where their influence is. Right. So those who are smart will introduce the disruption around the edge,
Mm-hmm.
and because in the edge there is very little spotlight
Yes.
from status quo. There is very little appetite by status quo to intervene because it's not worth their while.
Mm.
Okay, so that's the first principle. The second principle is to innovate, to introduce those disruption. You need to be part of a network. You need to find a network of like-minded people. When I say like-minded, like-minded in terms of purpose,
Yes.
like-minded in terms of values, like-minded in terms of a vision.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Beyond that, I think there's flexibility around how we do things, right? But those three are kind of really important around looking for like-minded network partners. And when you find, so that's a kind of like the second principle.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third principle is that once you find those networks, you want to look at the network to see whether you have all the components within the new network you're creating that is capable of disrupting a system.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I mean by that is that where most of these networks of struggle is that they look for people that are like them,
Yes.
right? But they they don't realize that there is when they look at the the the, the, the skill, the knowledge, the expertise that their network brings, there are gaps,
Yes.
right? So so one of the important thing is um, if you're looking for a network, you got to look for people obviously that are, if you are clinicians, you are looking for someone, who's like you as a clinician. So you will look at things about, how to introduce different models of patient care and
Mm-hmm.
services, etc., right? uh, then I think the one that's most palpable to me in terms of for startup is actually what I call business partners.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, the business partners, here I'm not talking about just people with money.
Yes.
In fact, people with money generally they want to control you.
There's a power
Right?
shift over there then, yeah.
They're the power shift. So that's why it comes back to the principle of looking for network partners to have the same purpose, same values, and same vision.
Yes.
So if you look at a good example is Haven, the one that just collapsed in the US,
Yes.
right? Now that one there, they failed on those. I don't know which of those three they failed in because they're so secret, right?
Mm.
But I suspect they were not. Um, I think that they shared the same purpose. I don't think their values were aligned, right? And I think the vision was maybe aligned,
Mm.
possibly not, right?
It was an
So
interesting mix of people, so I think, yeah, I agree with you. Probably the second two were a bit on the maybe side.
yeah. You just look at it, Amazon. Amazon just now charge ahead, and
Yeah.
it's just about to set up their own Amazon clinic for their staff, right? And if you look at that where that's heading, it's very clear they're gonna be commoditizing that sort of a service once they have sort of introduced that to their staff worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, so those come back to those principles. So I think you need to look at the network. So one of those things about network is not only new people in there that can provide you with funding,
Mm-hmm.
but also people that have got what I call developed channels and processes for distribution.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Um, so a good example, and you may have read of this case study already, um, and it's a different sector. So when you look at the Japanese car industry when they entered the US,
Mm-hmm.
none of the established uh, motor vehicle distribution network would touch them. And the reason for that is because those established distribution networks were actually aligned with the GE and the Ford, etc., right? So they
Partner.
do not want to yeah, they do not want to upset the big boys.
Mm.
So so the Japanese distribution network, when they went in, they actually had to look for a network that reached the target consumers they were looking at, but were not actually involved in selling cars.
Yes.
So there's an important principle here for healthcare is when we are looking for networks to reach into the population we're trying to help, which partners already have networks into their living room,
Mm.
into their lives, right? That's an important principle. The next principle is also, this is another tricky one for a lot of startups.
Mm.
The choice of the service you want to pick and the target population
Mm.
is fundamental.
Yes.
If you are starting with a service um, where mainstream is extremely strong
Mm.
and controls all the networks, right, and all the influences, is tough, right? It's not um, impossible,
Yeah.
right? But that's kind of where most startups starts, right?
Yeah, it always is, yes.
Yeah. So if that's the case, you need to do the second thing.
Mm.
The second thing is you need to look at where the unmet need is,
Mm.
because in any service there will be a segment of population which which cannot access the service
Yes.
for reasons of distance, time, financial resources, etc., etc. Right? That is the target population. Now, the reason why most startups don't go there is because these people are difficult to reach and they
Reach.
can't pay, etc., etc. So stuff, right? But that is actually the same reason why mainstream don't go there. So this is what I mean by the edge,
Mm. The fringe.
the fringe. Yeah. So so in going there, that's why you need a different network of partners. Who are the people who touches these people's lives
Mm.
but are not in healthcare?
Yeah.
Okay. And then another important principle is having found the partners, having found the service, having found the unmet need population, you cannot actually disrupt the system if you use the same business model
Mm.
as mainstream,
Yeah.
right? And in the business models, there are a couple of key elements. One of them is your value proposition to the unmet need population need to be very different from status quo
Mm.
value proposition, right?
Yeah.
The second one is that your key processes inevitably need to be different
Mm.
and need to bear in mind how it delivers the key proposition.
Mm.
And inevitably, it is about improving access, it's about convenience, it's about being uh, effective, but with no frills,
Yeah.
right? Um, and the final one then is always within the key processes, you will see that there needs to be some sort of um, introduction of smart technology
Mm.
without being carried away and dehumanizing the human content, right?
Yes.
Now, the reason why you need a smart technology is because that's a point of difference from mainstream.
Yeah. That's where mainstream still hasn't accepted or
Correct.
integrated themselves yet.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. And then the yeah. So having found the value proposition, having now redesigned and come up with new processes, right? They
Mhm.
incorporate smart technology. The next thing is to look carefully at the resources needed to execute those new processes, be they workforce, be they technology, uh, or facilities,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and how those three elements of resources uh, is put together need to make sure it's not bastardizing the key processes that somehow compromises the value proposition, because that happens a lot
Yeah.
when we are recruiting, developing resources. somehow we managed to completely dilute the process.
Mm.
All right. So yes, we got the resources, but it actually now has diluted the process.
Mm.
And when we start executing the process, it actually now falls short of delivering the value proposition.
True.
Okay.
Yes.
And then the fourth element, which is very important, is looking at uh, the financial model.
Yes.
And the financial model requires very careful thought of how you design the pricing strategy.
Mm.
Because with a lot of startup, Anjali, I'm sure you've come across that often,
Mm.
is that there is, you're under pressure to actually demonstrate the utility of your innovation,
Yes.
and there's pressure to generate revenue uh,
Revenue
within a
traction.
certain within a certain time frame because of the liquidity issue, right?
Yes.
And that's the problem with a lot of startups. So unless you are able to actually find a deep pocket benefactor or funder, those pressure is there with you from day one,
Yes.
right?
And traction as well. I think now in the startup world, one is of course the profits, but also a lot traction has become a very key measure of success. How
Yeah,
many people download the app? How many people visit the website? So the measures of
yeah,
success have
yeah. The
changed as
measures,
well.
yeah. So and the measures come back to actually from the very first principle is around the choice of your partner
Mm.
when you select people in your network, especially those who are providing funding, right?
Yes.
Um, so I see that too often that this. So they may share the same purpose, they may have this kind of the same values, but they don't explore the values about bottom line
Mm.
uh, enough. And then the vision is kind of too general, but where a lot of the startup problems start is actually when the funder starts putting demands on measurements, like you say, to satisfy their board or whatever around progress, right?
Mm.
So there'll be, like you say, how many people have you talked to, how many leads have you got, how many people visit the website, etc., that sort of stuff, right? Um, so it comes back to the pricing model is very, very important, right? Which is kind of related, especially if you're in a market where you are a private provider and you kind of need to generate income
Mm.
to pay for the cost, right? And to generate some sort of return for your investors. Now, if the understanding of the financial equation and the strategy is not threshed out from the very beginning, and what I mean by that is that um, I think there needs to be for startup in the health sector,
Mm.
from my perspective, when I look at a few there, those very few that actually managed to be successful, right? Um, they initially start off by making sure that they have identified the market really well, the unmet need, right? They have really been smart about picking the right smart technology. They have recruited some and have partnered with some really excellent team,
Mm.
right? And then they have adopted a financial strategy which kind of looks like this. Our phase one of our fiscal strategy is not to show that we can make a profit.
Mm.
The phase one is to demonstrate that we can generate demand and we can generate the consumers are prepared to pay
Yes.
for the service, right? And so in phase one, the metric should be about, are we able to generate demand?
Mm.
Are we able to generate demand where people are able to not just take it for free, but actually are indeed prepared to pay something,
Yes.
right? Then comes developing phase two, which is, so how do we look at the demand and look at the ability to pay to actually put it on some sort of a growth platform,
Mm.
and that based on our understanding of all these people who have now consumed our service, have actually paid for something.
Yeah.
How do we use that insight to develop phase two, which might help us introduce and modify some of our services to stimulate, consolidate more demand,
Mm-hmm.
right? That generates more value, that results in the consumers being more prepared to pay the next incremental price.
Price.
Yeah. Remember, if the value in the eyes of the consumer is less than the price,
You're not going to
they're,
succeed.
they're not going to go to the next step.
No.
So, in fact, so and you can't. And to me, that's where the big challenge is, right?
Mm.
Yeah. So come back to the whole disruption thing.
Yeah.
So if you look at healthcare, whether it's public uh, or private, I think that those principles I talk about are kind of the key linchpin.
Yeah.
Now, this is the what, right?
Mm.
The problem with the what is these tools and the what I've talked about require new tools
Yes.
and new knowledge and new skills, right? Right. And 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 all those tools and knowledge and skills that's required needs to be constantly updated, because all we have done is articulate the principles,
Mm.
right? You constantly need new tools, new skills, and new knowledge to be able to turn those principles into reality.
Yes.
And this is where we come to our most important point around what it takes to actually to disrupt, right? We need to look at uh, who are the people that is part of our team, um, because to me there are a couple key fundamental ingredients. The first one is they must share the same purpose,
Mm.
must share the same values, and must share the same vision.
Yep.
This is even our staff and the people recruit, right? Because
Yes.
if they don't, they are there for the wrong purpose. They're there for the wrong values,
Yeah.
and they're there for they have a different vision,
Mm.
right? And at some point, no matter how brilliant these people are, there will be
Issue.
a parting of ways, guaranteed,
Mm.
right? So um, part of that selection is also, and this is a key point I see again and again, is even if they do share all those things, right? But if they are not learners,
Mm.
and if they are not team players,
Mm.
and if they lack courage, then uh, they don't fit.
Yeah.
So too often you see new initiatives that have recruited some of the best brilliant mind,
Yeah.
but they are not learners. When I say learners, uh, learning new things
Yeah.
constantly, right?
Continuous learning.
Continue learning. And I'll come back to the learning of it. And also, they're not team players. They're happy to be part of the team as long as they're always leading it, right?
Yeah.
That's not what we need when we kind of trying to disrupt something that's moving and complex, right? And finally, I think that the courage is an important thing, because you might have all those first two requirements, but courage actually is about stepping at some point to do something when you don't have all the facts,
Mm.
when you are actually going to step beyond your comfort zone, and you know that in doing so, if I'm really blunt, there is a price to be paid.
Mm. And
right?
I completely agree with that, Chai, because I think that is something that being in the startup scenario I've kind of had to develop continuously and being faced with new scenarios. And I think COVID itself was a big blow to a lot of startups. But I want to come back on the point of learning because, in fact, that was my last question, was because, like you very honestly said, that someone actually pointed out to you that you were a reactive thinker. What what would your advice now be to individuals who are keen to develop a proactive thinking approach in healthcare? So how where do people start? What can they do? Is it to do with learning? Is it training? Or is it just thinking differently?
So I'm gonna um, throw a couple of things, and they're all part of the answer, right? So I don't think it's any one thing, right?
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is to um, and for me, I left it very, very late in my career. I think it's very important to get a coach.
Mm,
Super important, you know. And in my own experience, I left it far, far too late. However, in saying that, it was the icing on the cake for me because while I didn't have a coach until very late in my career, I was a learner anyway,
yeah.
right? It's just that the coach pushed me way, way faster
Mm,
and took me to places that I would have got there, but I would have got there much slower.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And more importantly, the coach actually forced me to open up parts of my brain that I did not think existed.
Mm,
So number one, get a coach. Not any coach. So take a time and find a coach that really it's not someone that you go and tell stories with, right?
yes.
It's not someone that's kind of like and it's sort of like quite formulaic and just tell you do this sort of stuff, right? It's someone that actually that you can spend time with that gets to understand you
Mm,
and actually then makes suggestions and pushes you
mm,
uh, to think differently and to act differently
yes.
and to encourage you and tell you that okay, well, that was good. Now that you I can see that you're really pushing yourself, so you have now just redefined your comfort zone. The
Yeah.
next step is not to stay there. The next step is to actually take the next step forward.
Yes.
And you're kind of thinking, well, I just got here. But a coach does that. A good coach does that. So that's number one. The the second one then is the um, you got to really like people if you want to lead. If
Yes.
you want, if you don't like people, well, there are very few Steve Jobs in the world, right?
Yeah.
You
True.
can be arrogant, you can be loud and rude, this sort of stuff, and unfortunately, most people with that personality trait don't succeed. There's the odd Steve Jobs, etc., etc. But if you don't like people, and if your attitude towards people is you consider them as below you
Mm,
or as just resources, then you're not going to succeed.
no.
All right. And the reason for that is then come back to the third thing in terms of my suggestion to people who wants to take up this challenge is you got to understand what it means to be part of a team.
Mm,
All right. And being part of a team means that you got to understand yourself.
yeah.
What do you bring to the team and what's missing?
Very.
And do other people in the team bring the missing bits? And if they do, if you have the opportunity to create the environment, are you creating an environment that allows these people to use their talent,
Mm,
which you don't have,
yes.
right? Um, and that really very challenging the more senior you get because
Mm,
unconsciously you think that to lead means you always have to actually be in front.
mm. And you're better. There's this
Correct.
assumption that if you're on top, if you're the boss, then you have a lot more skills than anyone else.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So I use the phrase, if you want to be a leader, you need to know what it takes to lead from the front,
mm,
what it takes to lead from the middle, and what it means to lead from the back.
mm.
They are not the same,
Then,
right? Um, and the other thing about getting there in terms of taking up this challenge as well is being proactive. Is do a self-diagnosis of where you are, of how your mindset is, and what I mean by that is, and I use this phrase, so most of our leaders and thought and decision makers um, are still looking into the trenches,
yes.
right? So I would say, don't. How much of your time is spent looking down,
Mm,
as opposed to just even looking up,
mm,
right? If you're looking up, are you looking actually around you?
mm.
So looking up is one thing,
Yeah.
but are you looking around? All right. The next thing is, if you're looking around, how far out do you look?
Mm,
Okay. Now, on the very last point, there is a very practical exercise that I would suggest your listeners to try and do, and then it takes a bit of commitment,
mm,
but it's worthwhile doing it. And it's because of this exercise that led me to look for a coach.
mm,
The exercise was, if you deem yourself to be a strategic and significant leader in healthcare or aspire to be one,
mhm,
right, sit down and write what you think the health system will look like
mm,
in 10 years or 20 years' time,
mhm,
not from the lens of a bureaucrat,
mm,
not from the lens of a clinician or a policymaker or funder,
mm.
but from the lens of a consumer.
That's really interesting.
I guarantee you, the first few attempts, most people will be shocked at how terrible it looks like, because you realize you can't. And the reason why you
Yeah.
can't is um, because of the mindset. It's so close, you
Mm,
know, and that's what actually got me to the coach.
mm,
Now, and one of my first questions to the coach was, why am I struggling with this?
mm,
All right. So he said to me, being able to think it's not a problem. The problem is your brain's, has had 30 years of thinking the same way.
mm,
You meet the same type of people, you read this similar type of material, you listen to similar type of voices,
mm,
you go to very predictable places. He said, we need to disrupt every single thing of every one of these elements.
mm.
So this is my suggestion, right? So a part of the self-diagnosis is to sit down and write
Yep.
from the lens of a consumer. And the consumer is, in this case, the person who got me to do this actually gave me the persona. And the persona was uh, I was a Muslim man.
Mhm,
Um, I'm married. I've got a wife. I'm a clinician, uh, and I've just immigrated to New Zealand, and my wife is pregnant.
mm,
And what I'm and I'm now, and this is 10 years ago, right?
mm,
And this is now 2025, right? So how will my wife and I experience the New Zealand Health Service,
mm.
right? I wrote the first one. I looked at it and said, it is so bad. It's so bad because it looks so much like today,
Yeah,
with
and there's so
a
many
thin
layers
veneer.
to it. Yeah, there's so many layers to it.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges for people, for me anyway, when it was trying to get away from the lens of being, a health administrator, a policymaker, a funder, et cetera, right? But to completely pack all those things and like to try and imagine
Mm,
myself um, from a different religion,
mm,
different skin color, being completely dislocated from all my networks and anything familiar, and coming to a different country, and I have a strange accent,
mm,
right? And how
It,
how
it just got me really thinking because, and you know what, I love this activity. I'm gonna, because I teach MBA health, right?
yeah,
So I might actually make my MBA students do this because they of course don't have that many years of experience behind them. They're pretty fresh right now,
yeah,
and it would be really interesting to see what they come up with on a
yeah,
similar question.
yeah. See what that does is that and if if you got your MBA students to do that, if the smart ones,
Mm,
what they would what they should do,
mm,
if they realize they don't have the life experience,
mm,
they should go out and meet people like the scenario.
mm,
That will take them completely out of the comfort zone,
yes.
right? Um, so that was a very interesting exercise for me,
Mm.
um, because I actually, when the coach told me I like imagine and creativity, I was actually quite horrified because I thought, man, uh, am I? Because I like people. I go out quite a lot.
Mm,
Because when I was running a health system, a CEO, I spent 50% of my time in the community.
mm,
I mean, I would go to community meetings, refugee groups, lower socioeconomic groups, Rotary clubs, Lions Group, principals meeting,
yeah.
whatever was going, I'll be there, right? But obviously, that wasn't enough
Mm,
because I went there with a particular lens,
yes.
right?
True.
And yeah, and that was the problem.
Yeah. Thank
I
you
was
so much.
filtering everything.
Yeah.
I was filtering everything.
Yes, I completely get it now because I think if I want to try this activity myself, and I'm pretty sure when I sit down, I'm going to definitely struggle with this because I would only, in some ways, slightly hindered by the lens of trying to build a startup in health.
Yeah.
So that in a way baggage would definitely affect how I'm going to write. In fact, I'll try this activity and send it through to you. But
Yeah, yeah. I love to help you in your class with that because I'll tell you the context of that. I had just been appointed as the acting director general,
mm,
and the head of public service who recruited me basically said to me, "You have to actually um, restructure your executive team, right? Because there are all sorts of issues about that. He says, da da da, so. So, hearing the word restructuring, I'm thinking, okay, well, that means I'm going to be, drawing up new organizational structure, writing job description, blah, 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 so stuff, right?
mm,
So, fortunately for me, I think it was more gut instinct. I can't realize that a structure and a management structure, particularly,
mm,
is somewhere in the middle of part of a much bigger process, right?
mm,
And that's why I actually went out and hired um, a team coach
mm,
for my entire executive team.
mm.
Uh, and the team coach, first task I said to them was, I think if I were to restructure the executive team without doing something else, I'm starting something in the middle. She said, you're absolutely right. She says, uh, a changing a management structure, organizational structure, funding levers, etc., sort of stuff is part of a much bigger process that starts with a vision
Yes.
uh, and a mission to deliver the vision and developing a strategy to fulfill the mission,
Mm,
and then uh, using some of the more complex tools of a target operating model to execute the strategy. That was completely alien to me.
mm,
And when I listen to this sort of stuff, I say, well, all those steps, I hear those words, I actually don't know what it all means.
mm,
Then I said, okay, why don't we start somewhere? She said, okay, we'll do strategy.
mm,
But before strategy, I want to see your vision.
mm.
That's when she got the entire executive team, including me, to do that exercise.
Yes.
I can tell you, apart from me, nobody else completed the exercise.
It is really hard because I don't think people understand in many ways. how your environment, or how, things like skin color, or where you've grown up, where your education, it completely creates a lens through which you look at life. And throwing that away and trying to embody the persona of someone who's completely unlike you
Yeah,
has to be very difficult. And you have to start looking at life. All of a sudden you may not have that privilege, or you may have excessive privilege. It can go either ways when you're looking
yeah,
at it, and that would just completely shake up a thought process.
yeah. And also, I think the other think about, I mean, we are moving into an area of
Mm,
understanding the user or the consumer or the community, whichever word we want to use, right?
yeah.
And I think this is partly the challenge is that um, being given the trust and the privilege
Mm,
of understanding your community is rare,
mm,
because you can rely on a lot of tools and big data and that other stuff, right? But really, I mean, one of the real pleasures uh, of my time when I was the CEO of a health system, and I actually was in charge of a socio-economic community, and that was towards the lower end,
mm,
and there were lots of different groups,
mm,
and when I intellectually understood the need and the value to reach out to them
mm,
to understand their need,
yeah.
right? So, and when I started, I was actually using a lens of a chief executive, right?
Mm,
So the most stunning example I can give you is that I remember one evening going to a community meeting of the Tongan people from Tonga,
mhm,
and I think it was a Thursday evening, and I brought 3 or 4 of my senior staff with me, uh, and we went there with a prepared presentation,
mm,
right? Now, these people were meeting in the teachers' common room in the local high school, and
mhm,
I went there. They were very polite. They got us to go up front, sit down, and the facilitator introduced us, and they said, "The floor is yours." Right?
mm,
So, true to form, I stood up, I had my presentation, I started speaking,
mm,
introducing who we are, blah, 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 why we're here. So that. I didn't actually get through 5 minutes of that when right at the back of a room, there was an elderly gentleman
mm,
who looks like the spitting image of a younger Nelson Mandela.
mm,
He put his hand up, he interrupted my rhythm. And when I sort of acknowledged him, he sat down and he stood up, and then he said to me, he says, we're very privileged to have a chief executive of any organization from public service to come to us.
mm,
And, so thank you for doing that and bring your team. Then he said something that really shocked me. That's a hit to the core. He said, you must want something from us, otherwise you won't be here.
mm.
That really hurt.
Yeah.
Right? So it became, oh, that's true. He said something. He said, we would like to help,
Mm,
but we don't trust you.
mm,
Uh, if you want to help, you need to get our trust.
yes.
Because if we don't trust you, we are not going to tell you because we don't know what you're going to do with it.
Mm,
So I stopped the meeting afterwards. So I said to him straight away, I said, so what do we need to do to get the trust? He says, so this is the first time here. How about coming back next week?
mm,
I said, what would I do? He said, just come and sit down and a cup of tea with us and listen to the conversation.
mm,
Uh, the people will be nervous having you in our midst, but we'll see how often you come back. So actually, I stopped straight away and we sat down and I said to my staff, we're not going through the presentation. We're now going to sit down and have cups of tea with these guys.
mm,
So when we left the meeting, my staff was greatly disillusioned.
mm,
They were saying, what a waste of time, so we just wasted. I said, well, we have to come back next week. They said, well, why?
mm,
We won't be doing anything, you know. Anyway, to cut the long story short, I came back many, many weeks, right? I did nothing except sit there and listen to them talk. I mean, and sometimes they were talking in Tongan, which I didn't understand either. But I kept turning up. And then many weeks later, the same guy came up to me. He says, where are the rest of your friends?" I said, they now have other things to do.
Hmm.
He said, "Well, you are still here." He says, "I think we are ready to do something together."
Mm,
That taught me a lot of our understanding. And what they told me, what they need,
mm,
never in 100 years would I think about it.
mm,
And actually, some of them was illegal. We can't do it.
mm.
But that was their need,
Yeah.
right? So the interesting thing was they realized it was also illegal.
Mm,
And they said to me, "You have asked us what we need. We have told you what we need. By the way, this is not everything. This is just a starter,
mm,
a starter kit, right? We actually don't expect you to do anything with it because nobody has so far. Why should you be different?" Right? Uh, and actually, the funny thing is, I actually took that list back to my Pacific Island advisor,
mm.
who is actually a Samoan. And this person looked at the list and said, "Chai, you cannot be serious to even contemplate doing even one of this, because none of them fits with our plans." We have all these ideas ourselves. Right? To cut the long story short, I actually um, re- rewrote the plan with that community. And in fact, they became the vanguard
Mm,
and the shining light among all the other island nations communities, right? That did the same things. And eventually, together with them, those beautiful plans we had was completely meaningless.
mm,
And what we ended up with was just one or two things for each community that came from them that we could do,
mm.
right? And some, like I said, most of those things we would not have thought about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's interesting when when you actually talk to people rather than always just look at data, because I think from a research perspective, unfortunately, qualitative research in healthcare, it's all about trials and quantitative data.
yeah, yeah,
Qualitative research, interviews, talking to people, observing them, does not hold good, what do you say, credibility amongst healthcare professionals. But whereas even in my PhD research, the amount of data I got when I spoke to people
yeah,
versus what I got out of survey forms was miles apart.
yeah. So there is a concept. You've heard of the Carnarvon framework?
No, I
You've heard?
haven't. I'll look it up.
Okay, okay. So it's a guy called David Snowden. I actually met him. He's English or Welsh, I can't remember, but he's really like a med professor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I actually brought him out to New Zealand. And in the framework, he says that the way we look at situations falls into four domains:
Mm-hmm.
a simple domain, a complicated domain, a complex domain, and a disorder domain, right? And in a simple domain, uh, the cause and the effect and the remedy is entirely predictable and well known and established. So the only intervention there is to use best practice.
Mm-hmm.
The complicated one is that uh, there are many causes, there are many possible solutions, right? And all of them are not perfect, but they all contribute to giving you some of the answers.
Mm-hmm.
So data is important,
Yeah.
but data is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get experts to help you with the data, you can develop good practices to solve complicated solutions. Right? You see, the challenge is most of our real world problems are now in the complex domain, which basically means the cause is not well understood, uh, and the effect is not cannot be predicted until on hindsight,
Mm-hmm.
right? and the only way to solve complex problem is not just to rely on data, but to actually look at the nuances. Ilyas
Yes.
Kayani,
Yes.
he used the word analog rendering
Yes.
of big data. I really like that phrase.
Yes.
And so it is actually, so that Kanabin framework talks about reading the narrative behind the quantitative
Mm.
data, because in a complex domain, it is the narrative that actually bring to life the quantitative data,
Yes.
and add so much more that the zeros and ones can't actually explain.
No. Completely agree with that.
Yeah, yeah,
So, um, brilliant. So many interesting thoughts. I have to at some point write a summary of all of this together. But I think, you know, a lot of food for thought. I really liked the way you laid out how individuals getting into health or in health can start working proactively or thinking proactively or building proactively for that matter. And so, yeah, a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I think we did slightly run out of time, but then I think we can keep talking for a long time. Probably I'll get you on for another talk at some point. But
sure.
it's been an honor, and thank you so much.
Yeah,
I
Anjali,
Yeah.
and if I can help,
Mm.
particularly with that first interesting exercise you're thinking about,
Yes.
whether it's for you or for your class, let me know. I'm more than happy to do that.
Very, very well. I'll definitely build that into my, because I'm teaching a module in September, and I was thinking this sounds like a really good activity to bring in right at the beginning, in the first few weeks of the module, to start getting them thinking that way. I think that will set a really good foundation for it. So definitely I'll stay in touch with you regarding this, and I'm definitely going to try this out one of these days, and I'll send you a
Okay.
copy of my first
Okay.
draft as it is, and
All
hopefully
right.
I can improve with time.
Yeah. All right then.
Thank you so
Anjali.
much. Have a
Yeah,
good
nice
day.
to talk to you.
Lovely
Yeah,
talk.
you too. All right then. Bye.
Bye. Thank you everyone for watching this podcast. Please remember to subscribe to my newsletters on the website for weekly updates and further podcasts. Hope you have a great day. Stay safe and bye bye.